After almost 5 years, the Small Data Forum, the monthly podcast on the uses and abuses of data, big and small, in media, politics, and public life, that Neville Hobson, Sam Knowles, and I started in May 2016, a month before the Brexit referendum, has invited its first guest. Darren Lilliker, Professor for Political Communication at Bournemouth University, will tell us about his work on the phenomenon of permanent campaigning, the sense that image and selling in politics have become more important than governing, how the UK government's performance during the global pandemic compares to other countries. And in a political environment where the charismatic showman seems to trump the fact-focused, consensus-seeking legislator, he speculates how someone like Margaret Thatcher would fare today. My name is Thomas Stöckler, and I should disclose that Darren is also the supervisor of my PhD at Bournemouth University. So here's the interview, the first, I'm sure, of many, and to add even more perspective to the Small Data Forum, you can find it all at www.smalldataforum.com. I start out by asking him about changes in the field, especially since 2016, that fateful year that brought us Brexit and Trump. Without any further ado, welcome, Professor Lilliker.
Thank you very much.
So, in my introduction just now, I said, you've been doing a lot of work on this, and I know you're involved in also a couple of publications on specifically perceptions of COVID. So we'll come back to that. But a more general question to start out with: you've been teaching political communication for more than 20 years. I've referenced June 2016 earlier. In that context, I wonder, have you detected step changes in the field and its subjects, in particular in the last few years, perhaps even especially since the run-up to the EU referendum in the UK, and anything that follows? And if so, what might be the reason for that?
Well, very big question. I think politics has generally evolved over the last decades, become more professional and coordinated, more strategic in terms of all communication having a focus on meeting objectives, more designed for a whole range of different media outlets, more focus on the personal and the personalization aspects, and having the spokesperson at the heart of it, and increasingly more integrated with commercial, public relations, advertising, marketing, communication, whatever we want to call that. And I think this has become more and more intense and permanent. So, that idea of the permanent campaign being slightly different has almost gone away. That we now have this constant way of doing things where every single word is meant to contain the message. The slogans and the key buzzwords have to be present. It's about getting your message across, suppressing alternative readings of what you're trying to get across, and where you are in a difficult position to not fall into the bear trap that journalists are setting up for you. And I think that is the intensity of that seems to be increasing, and the COVID period has seen a greater intensification of that because of the speed of change and the speed of events, if you like. But as soon as a politician announces something, they're proved wrong, but not by their own fault, which is unusual, but by the fault of this thing happening. So it becomes more and more intense in those circumstances.
So I have a follow-up question on that. So what you're describing sounds very much like, it's almost like automated, optimized messaging. And you mentioned the role of journalism and politicians being afraid of bear traps that may be led. At the same time, we have this big issue around trust in institutions, trust in politics, and often when people talk about potential ways forward in mitigating the problem, they talk about transparency and authenticity and, you know, wonderful buzzwords like that. But where's transparency and authenticity in this kind of automated, optimized messaging?
Well, it's not present, and almost that's the point. Couple of anecdotes from research. That there was a candidate I interviewed in 2001 who didn't get elected because he ended up not campaigning because he didn't want to be a speak your weight machine, and he felt that that's what he was supposed to be on the doorstep. He was walking around a Nottinghamshire former pit village with these lists of slogans that he had to deliver on the doorsteps. And if somebody said the euro to him, he had a message from the script. If he had employment, there was a message from on this script. And he was very disillusioned with that, and he walked away from politics. And at the same time, when you talk to voters, they see this. They don't talk about professionalization and marketization and mediatization, but they talk about politicians lying, not answering questions, always trying to hide something. And although it's impossible to prove because these two things are kind of independent variables in their own sense, the decline of trust and the increase of professionalization and campaigning norms being embedded into everyday politics have moved along in the same pace. Trust has declined as politicians have increasingly gone on this professionalization line. And, you know, talking to politicians over the many years, they see the public as disengaged, so they need to be able to engage them. It needs to be simple, it needs to reach them, it needs to hit the right buttons. They're aware that journalists are more able to do that than they are themselves, so they need the journalists to be, you know, delivering their message and not contradicting them. And, you know, they also recognize the fact that they have very little space to get across to a mass audience. You know, that there's no chat shows that will take a politician. There's no space for them to get their message across. And yes, the internet and social media and all of those channels are good ways of reaching people, but it's very sporadic. And it's just as easy to get lost because you've got all the influencers that are out there that are embedded in the internet that people want to actually hear from and subscribe to. You know, so there's all these challenges within communication, and all the politicians strive to try to be authentic, but the way that they have to stay on message and not stray and not go off and give their own personal, you know, feelings. And this is where people like Trump and Nigel Farage have an advantage because they're not constrained. They don't follow rules. But, you know, the Johnson cabinet, the Starmer cabinet front bench, all of them, they're constrained by the rules because they have to be seen as a coherent, cohesive party, because if not, they fail.
How much of that, this is just some, again, looking back to 2016, of course, we had the EU referendum in June, and then we had the election of Donald Trump in November that same year. And then afterwards, a lot of analyses went in the direction of there being some kind of alignment in the messaging and the way that populism was driven. Some people even talk about sort of an orchestrated campaign where it was more or less run by the same people and similar interests and so on. How much of what you're seeing and what you've described right now feels like a very specific Anglosphere problem, almost a British American, maybe including Australia here for particular reasons, issue rather than a global phenomenon where it can be seen almost everywhere in comparable ways?
It's a global thing, and it's global because every campaign, permanent election, referendum, whatever it is, needs to win. And within the bunkers, they decide what it is they need to say to win. And our colleague Dalia, in her work on Egypt, said that the two candidates that emerged in 2012, I think, is the election, took an approach of do anything to win. That's their strategy. And that seems to have embedded itself in politics. What do we need to say to win? What do we need to say to get the upper hand in this debate? Do we need to attack the opponent and slag them off? Do we need to, basically outright lie and say these figures are wrong? Do we need to denigrate the media and call them fake? All of this atmosphere that has been suddenly evolving, I think in 2016, it kind of came to a head in two ways. One is public dissatisfaction with this, that a large number of people rejected traditional politicians. And Trump is not a traditional politician. Boris Johnson in 2016 is not a traditional politician. Farage is not. They break those traditions. They go outside of that political box and they appear to be ordinary, not scripted, not sculpted messages. And so, Brexit was a rejection of the status quo of things carrying on the same. Trump, in a way, was the same. That this steady, even trajectory where things are just going to continue the same was rejected on both sides, but also rejected in Brazil with Bolsonaro, in Italy with Modi, an election of many other semi-populists, the growing support for the AfD in Eastern Germany, populists across a lot of Eastern Europe. All of these people are part of these same trends where there's a public very dissatisfied with the continuance of managerial anodyne politics that seem detached from their lives, and these characters that fill that void.
I'd like to explore that particular area a little bit more. I know last year you published a fairly extensive meta-analysis of permanent campaigning together with a colleague, Ikaro Joathan. What was the what were the most surprising findings for you in that study, and what sort of main you described some of the issues before, but what were some of the main recommendations that you came up with?
Well, I mean that work was designed to try to find a kind of a universalist model of how do we measure permanent campaigning, and what measures do we use to see it in place within a country. I suppose that the striking thing about that was the amount of research across many countries that found a continual use of opinion polling. So the constant drawing in of data, what do the public think? And we've had these inferences for many years that politicians are concerned about the polls and obsessed by their standing in the polls at the end of 1 week. And also the crafting of messages. So it suggests that there is an obsession, or at least a great deal of focus placed on mini campaigns. Each event, each week, each outing on television, each little that journey between a speech and the outcome, the thing that's delivered, whenever it is delivered, is a mini campaign where public opinion for the overall outcome of what we're doing is being tested, but also any fluctuations in opinion. And end of that week, are we level? Have we gone up slightly? Have we dropped slightly? Where are we? And I think that is something that probably came in the 1990s, and not looking at Tony Blair particularly, but the Blair era, Bill Clinton, Gerhard Schroeder, many of those characters brought in a new degree of professionalization in terms of concentration on image and who they were and how they were seen. And everything they did was part of a kind of a branded approach to thinking about politics. What am I saying about my brand when I'm doing this? And I think that's where this, you know, it's fine when this is new in a way. It was criticised, you know, that classic of Blair's "this is not a day for sound bites and deliver one," but it's when everyone's doing it, it becomes both obvious but also mundane. You know, that the strive for authenticity suddenly becomes so obvious, and so the authentic becomes the man in the pub that shouts loud, which is how I would equate the kind of communication strategy of people like Trump and Farage. They're that opinionated guy in the corner of the pub, but there's authenticity about them. Whereas the politicians, as they become anodyne and soundbite driven and, you know, branded, it's a whole different, you know, controlled form of authenticity, more scripted, less natural.
The man in the pub that shouts loudest evokes this image of German has a phrase for this, and it's called Stammtischparolen. So Stammtisch is in a German village pub. There would be one table where only the real locals, and they used to be only men, of course. That table would be reserved for them. Nobody else would be allowed to sit there, even if the place is full. That table needs to be empty. It's the Stammtisch. It's where the elders sit and drink their beers. And then when they start politicizing and they throw around their idea, that's how Stammtischparolen are being generated. I always liked that image. I didn't like the messaging that was generated in that context. But it does make me wonder, the way you're describing this, if the only purpose is winning and the data that gets generated is all about what does that part of the public that we need to have for winning, what do they think? And optimization then happens for that kind of electoral success. How do you ever go back to any kind of broader common denominator? How do you not constantly move further into sort of insulated interest groups?
Well, yes, can you? I mean, I think that if we can get to a position in politics where those who do not perform authenticity well are actually respected, and, you know, characters like Gordon Brown or Theresa May, just take, you know, sort of two sides of the coin. You know, neither of them were ever liked really in public opinion because of their lack of emotionality and their lack of authenticity, and that they didn't, you know, they didn't come across well. They weren't charismatic. I think we need to respect characters like them rather than hunting for the charismatic. And I think that's something where media and politics need to accept who it is that makes what it is that makes a good politician. And when you actually think about the job, that if you want a figurehead, you know, if you want a kind of a president figure such as they have in Italy that doesn't really have a political role, then it's fine. You want someone charismatic. You want someone to go out and reflect the will of the people. But legislation is boring. You know, it's about reading reports, synthesizing data, figuring out the best way to do something. And largely you find that the people who are suited for those sorts of jobs are not the sort of people who are then going to be doing this great rousing performance. Or if they are, they're going to have some very, very good people around them that will sort that out for them. And I think we need to, as a society, as a world, really think about politics of who it is we actually want. What sort of characteristics do we want in the people in power, as opposed to their performance You know, if you want a good performer, let's go to the movies, but let's not go and watch Prime Minister's Questions Times, which is the worst entertainment thing you could ever get. But that is the showpiece of Parliament. This horrible tit-for-tat insult throwing across the House of Commons that has nothing to do with legislation or even scrutiny. But that is, it's entertainment, it's controversy, they insult one another. But that's not what politics is about. And I think getting back to what politics should be about, which is, you know, debate and coming up with a consensual position, something that people can agree on and unite around and see as being sensible and not driven by the whims of one or the other side of an ideological divide. And a lot of things seem to polarize people, but once they become polarized, they then don't necessarily go and look for consensus somewhere else. So those people who hate Boris Johnson may be least likely to comply with anything he says around COVID-19 because he's been polarizing previously. And be similar if Jeremy Corbyn had become Prime Minister in 2019. You know, that those who hate him would not respect what he says, even though he is the leader through a crisis. And that's what we saw with America with Trump, that he had his supporters and he had the people who hated him, and they diverged. And his messaging increased that, of course, but that's another story.
So that's an area I'd like to explore a little bit more. What could be seen as politics as usual, and how that might change under conditions of crisis. Of course, we have the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, and decision-making leads to exacerbating crises and so on. I mentioned at the beginning, you've been involved in quite a bit of research related to political communications and COVID-19. Recently, you published with colleagues, you published a large collection of international perspectives regarding political communications and COVID. Within that, what, if anything, makes the UK's approach different and perhaps unique amongst the countries you looked at?
Well, it's not unique. I suppose really it's in the middle band of countries that didn't do too badly in terms of some of the crises that occurred, and there's one unfolding in the Netherlands at the moment. So held things together reasonably well, but didn't do a fantastic job, if you like. Where to diverge? I think that many countries fell into a trap of claiming to be fully prepared and, you know, no pandemic will cause any problems whatsoever, and then a week, 2 weeks, a month later, suddenly that they realise, or everybody else realises, no, you're not prepared. And Britain was one of a large group of countries that said that. Like many countries, that initial lockdown seemed to be welcomed, you know, pretty universally. Yes, there were people who didn't like it, but there were a very, very small minority of voices that really opposed it. The longer it went on, the more those voices became agitated and anxious, and I think a lot of economic worries drove that. And then there was the beginning of the relaxation of the rules. And that's the point where the mixed messages and the things that had been ignored because we're having a lockdown and everything is focused on the lockdown and focused on dealing with the cases going into hospital and bringing those down. Boris Johnson was in hospital himself for a large period of that time. You know, but as soon as it started to be opened up, all these other questions, you know, like a Pandora's box opening and lots of Jack in the Boxes flying out of it, all going, what about me? You know, so education, you know, what happens with pubs, and these day-to-day questions and these longer-term questions, which weren't answered, and at the same time, no clear guidelines about how far people should travel. And so you have, you know, thousands of people coming to a beach where there's no facilities, including toilets and nowhere to eat and nothing, because nobody had opened everything else up. They just said, go where you like, travel, spread your legs, it's fine. Yeah, and all of that weakened the government's credibility, and they never really recovered in terms of public ratings from that. And I think that's the point, that they didn't think about how to put guidance or rules even in place for how to manage going back to some form of normal that they said was not going to be a full normal. It was going to be a semi-normal, but there was no rules for what that was. It was just, oh, wear masks in these places after a certain amount of time. You know, those rules never really came in. You know, it was too late when those rules did come in, I think.
Well, apparently we're getting a new normal at some point. So what that will look like, I guess we're all waiting with bated breath.
Just go. I think the thing that Johnson's learned from last summer is that we can't go through this constant lockdown, open up, and you've got to manage the exit from a lockdown in the same way as you can manage the pathway into it. And I think last summer he didn't think about that, or his advisors didn't. I don't know what was going on, but it was chaos. You know, it was D-Day. Let's go out and celebrate. The war is over, but it wasn't.
So it'll be interesting to see how that's going to be handled second time round. Now, final question. Beyond the short-term issues that we can all analyze as they happen in real time around COVID, what are you working on, and linking it back to the sort of the bigger picture? Where do you see the biggest impact of your work in terms of making this political communication space a little less noisy and a little less mad, if that's the right way to put it?
I think the impact is to be had at the level of people, that people have got to firstly be better informed when making their own decisions and not be beguiled by slogans from whatever side, and all sides of the spectrum use slogans. They shouldn't be beguiled by those. They need to get beyond that, not fall for misinformation, not fall for rubbish being circulated by bots from God knows where. But they've also, I think, there's got to be some sort of public awareness of what makes a good politician. You know, what makes people make the right decisions? What qualities do they need? And so what I was saying about was needed for politics is never going to come from politicians, but it can come from the people when they say, no, I don't want a character that does that. I don't want someone who clowns around as the Prime Minister. I want someone who's good with detail. I want someone who can understand the facts and go through it and go through every box and etc. You know, and I think we've had a history of very diligent politicians, Wilson, Thatcher, you know, that they would spend hours and hours going through those boxes and knowing every bit of detail and scaring the hell out of their civil servants because they knew so much. And we seem to have got to a stage now where just the way they talk on interviews and you know, programs like the Andrew Marr Show, they're not on top of their facts. They know the slogan, they've learned the slogan, but they don't know the facts behind it. And so they give these very loose, waffling answers. And it needs the public to not only say, no, we don't want that, but to give the vote to the people who clearly do know what they're talking about. And I think that's where the public can have and that is idealistic, but I think there's more to be done with the public than politicians, because politicians are led by what works with the media we've got and the voters they have. And when their current shtick doesn't work, they have to find a new one.
So I wonder whether this gives Margaret Thatcher and some others too much or too little credit, but there is this perception that, at least from Margaret Thatcher onwards, there was kind of a yin and yang of flamboyant to boring to flamboyant to boring in terms of prime minister. So Thatcher to Major, Blair to Brown, Cameron to Theresa May. Now we have Johnson to whoever would be the boring predecessor for Boris Johnson. Yeah, I'm not sure how that's going to pan out. But this, yeah, sorry.
Well, I mean, I think to call Thatcher flamboyant, if we looked at her now, would look very, very odd. She performed reasonably well, but compared to who was around her, it's comparative. But she undermined a lot of interviewers by actually knowing more than them. And her and Robin Day, there was no waffle. She would have bullet points of facts. Now, whether they were real or not, but she'd learned them. And she had, reference points for everything that every argument she was making. And that level of detail was both learned. So she's a very intelligent woman who's able to commit that to memory, but also, she had that level of detail was able to deliver it. The current, politicians don't do that, and so, like her or loathe her politics, her attention to the job, was something that it seems modern politicians don't have, or they have it, but they don't feel that doing that is going to work because the public aren't going to be interested. And that's where that relationship is open to some questions, because I'm sure there are members of the current cabinet that know all the facts, but if they don't feel that that's what is going to be the right thing to do to win their argument and get the point and win public support, they're not going to do it. They're going to stick with their slogan because that's what they think is the answer. Get the slogan out, repeat it until everyone's sick of it, and then everyone out there is starting to remember it.
So let's see where we are in 3 months' time, maybe 6 months' time, with the lockdown finally eased, and hopefully everything will operate under slightly different, improved conditions. And maybe we can have another conversation then, looking back and seeing what has been learned, how things hopefully will improve, and whether and how that political campaigning will finally evolve in a direction where it brings in a broader base of the society again, and not just the niche that politicians currently regard as they want to need to have for winning in the short term. Thank you very much, Professor Lilliker. This was most insightful, and yeah, it would be nice to have you back at some point and do more reflecting on the big and small aspects of data in the context of politics and political communication.
My pleasure. I love to talk.
Thank you. Let me just stop the recording.
I went on far too long.
That's fine. We can